Hello, I'm Luke, pastor of St Kilda Balaclava Presbyterian Church. In this video, I want to give an overview of the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis. This overview kind of sums up the last few sermons I've been doing from the series in Genesis 1 to 11, and I've called the series The Beginning of Everything. And what I want to look at in this video is an overview from Genesis 1 to 5 across sort of 6 topics, and you can see them there. Looking at Genesis chapter 1, God creates a good cosmos. Genesis chapter 2, humans are created on day 6. And then sort of focusing in on Genesis chapter 3, taking a look at Genesis chapter 4, and then finishing off with Genesis chapter 5. And so what this video is like an overview of the first 5 chapters of Genesis, both as a catch-up, if you've missed a sermon, or to remind yourself of this foundation. So let's dive straight into it. So as Genesis chapter 1 describes the creation of everything, and we see from Genesis chapter 1 that the world is a good gift. It's something created by God out of nothing, and it's created with a particular order and pattern. And just briefly, you can see this in the way that the days are organized. So the days are organized, the first 6 days are organized in a particular pattern, where it's almost as though God creates the light and the ground and the air and the water, and then he fills the light, the ground and the air and the water with plants and animals and people. And so the first 3 days and then the next 3 days kind of are this complementary pattern, 3 by 3. And day 7's a little bit different, something else. And we also see in Genesis chapter 1 that God looks at what he creates and says it's good, and then on the 7th time he looks at it, he says it's very good. So there's this sort of perfect pattern of this is a good world. And the first couple of chapters of the Bible and the last couple of chapters of the Bible are sort of the only chapters in the Bible without sin. So these chapters occur before sin, and then the very last few chapters of Revelation occur after sin has been defeated. And so these chapters are a little bit unique, and they're describing a world that we're not familiar with, a world pre-Adam, a world before the fall. So we see that from Genesis chapter 1, the world is a good gift. Now there's a lot more you could say, and there's a lot more questions about the age of the world and how God created the world. But if you wanted to just know what is Genesis 1 saying in summary, the summary would be that the world is a good gift, a gift from God to humanity. And also in a way it's a setup for the way, or a foreshadowing of the way God operates. He creates something and gives it to us, just like the Father will send his Son to us, and the Son will offer up his life as a gift to us. Now, Genesis chapter 2 sort of focuses on day 6. It sort of zooms in a little bit to the creation of humans. And when I preached on Genesis chapter 2, I looked at the Greek legend, the ship of Theseus. And the idea of the ship of Theseus was that, I hope I'm saying that correctly, you can put the correct pronunciation in the comments. The idea with the ship of Theseus was it started in one port with its original timber and sails and equipment, and then by the time it had finished its journey across the world, all the various parts of the boat had been replaced. And so the question is, was it the same vessel? And you could use that same question to think about people. What makes us human? So all the cells in our body um, die and are regenerated over the course of our life. In fact, that's the sad thing about cancer, is when cells don't stop regenerating and don't stop um, producing, they get out of control, and it's almost as though in each cell there's this little biological clock that says, okay, the 10 years are up, now it's time to pass on. So what makes us human in embryo, when we're born, when we're growing up, middle age, old age, and as we're dying? What's the consistency? Can't just be memory. It can't just be our name. What is it that makes us human across that whole that whole journey? And Genesis chapter 2 talks about the way in which men and women are made in the image of God. By the way, I've got here a little, sorry, on that side, a screenshot from the Bible Project, one of their videos on how to read the Bible. And this one's kind of done in a sort of Babylonian style, and it's presenting Adam and Eve. And I'll put a link to the Bible Project in the screen notes. Really worth looking at for getting an idea of the overview of the Bible and the themes and the words of the Bible. And so this is a screenshot to illustrate the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And through the history of Christianity, people have thought a lot about what is the image of God? What makes us like God? What is the thing about humans that's similar to God? And there's a couple of things you could say. You could say it's our ability to have relationships, our ability to be creators. We're sub-creators. God creates us, and then we create things. I'm creating this video. People create artistic things. People create practical things. What is it in particular? Is it our brains? Is it our morality? Is it our imagination that makes us human? And I'm suggesting from Genesis chapter 2 that what makes us human is our conscience, our rationality, and the fact that we're known by God. It's worth just quickly ducking into Genesis chapter 2 just to kind of see where I get that. God says to Adam, you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in verse 17 of chapter 2. And so there's this sense in which God gives Adam a conscience. His heart, he has an inbuilt source of right and wrong that God has given him, and that's an aspect of being human. But it's not the only thing that makes us human. It's not the sole thing that makes us human. Because also Adam's given the job of stewarding the garden, and importantly naming all the animals, ordering things, organizing things, imagining how things should be. So he's given this rationality. So those two things together help make us human. We wouldn't be human without our consciences, without our rationality. But I think there's one more thing, and it's not clearly described in the text. It's implied in Genesis 2, but it's really clearly brought out in Acts chapter 17, verse 28, where the Apostle Paul, he actually quotes another philosopher, but he says that what this philosopher was saying was true, and that in God we move and have our being. In other words, we exist because we're known by God. So what makes us human from birth all the way through our life? Well, it's not just that we learn what's right and wrong, because little babies might not have a clear sense of right and wrong, and sometimes later in life you might have dementia, or you might have not be fully aware of what you're doing, or not as smart as other people. And so it's neither conscience nor rationality that makes us human. It's the fact that we're known by God. Everybody, Christian or non-Christian, is known by God. And there's the sad thing about, and the dangerous thing, we'll get to sin in a moment, but the dangerous thing about sin is that there comes a point where we're no longer known by God. It's the end. So what makes us human? How do we solve the paradox of the vessel that changes its timber and its equipment from point A to point B? Well, it's the fact that there's a, to quote Paul van der Klee, there's a monarchical vision, and God has this monarchical vision, and He's able to know us and see us. Because without that outside view, we have no reference point. We have no clear thing that we can say, this is what makes us human. God makes us human. And now we get to sin in chapter 3 of Genesis. And in chapter 3 of Genesis, we looked at it across 2 weeks, 2 sermons. And in the first sermon, we looked at the bad swap. So another this side, another screenshot from the Bible Project. Talking snake comes into the garden, and Adam doesn't do anything about it. Adam just lets this talking snake come in and talk to Eve. And the snake offers a bad swap. In the kids' talk that Sunday, I talked about what makes a good swap or a bad swap with the kids. And Adam and Eve make a bad swap. They swap death with the devil for life with God. And that's the heart of sin. That's the problem of evil, is that we've made that swap. But then in a kind of a beautiful twist, the swap is turned around, is switched in the Great Exchange. And the Great Exchange is when Jesus exchanges his life for ours. And so this horrible event where, for reasons that we're not quite sure why, Adam and Eve choose this horrible thing instead of this good thing, that is then exchanged when Jesus dies on the cross in our place instead of us. And so the first half of Genesis chapter 3 describes this terrible exchange. And then we kind of get to the second half of Genesis 3. And in the second half of Genesis 3 is almost a response or an answer to the problem of evil. So that the problem of evil is, well, how do we reconcile a good God with the presence of moral evil in the world? And Genesis chapter 3 shows us that God gives us over to evil. I've got a picture there of a black hole, or not an actual picture of a black hole, an imaginative illustrative description of a black hole. And I like this one in particular. I know there's been an actual picture of a black hole that scientists recently took a photo of. It's kind of fuzzy and hard to see, but I really like this one. Pardon me. I really like this one because it kind of shows time and matter and energy all being sucked into the black hole. And it takes, even though it's kind of the forces are almost beyond comprehension, the forces of gravity and the amount of material being sucked in is sort of hard to comprehend. It's still taking time. It's not happening all at once. And that's kind of also the narrative of Scripture and our experience in our lives, is that God is giving us over to evil. We're seeing we're seeing evil unfold slowly, but we can see that there's a particular destination. And it's worth just noting where I get this from in Genesis chapter 3. Because remember the serpent's word, so the talking snake that slithers into the garden says to Eve, "You will not surely die. You're not going to die immediately." And Eve and Adam, for reasons that we won't get to figure out on this side of eternity, think that that's a fair exchange, that to be like God for a season is worth the risk of death. And God gives us over to that choice, that horrible choice. And that's kind of reinforced by the cherubim. Probably a good way of understanding that phrase, cherubim, is battle angel, warrior angel, and the sword, and the way in which Adam and Eve are cast out east of Eden. East of Eden is kind of this symbol of exile, and Babylon is east of the land of Israel. It's this sort of being away from God, outside God's presence. So God's allowing Adam and Eve to live, kind of giving the serpent's words a certain validity for a little while as a strange act of mercy. You're going to see what it's like. And then in Genesis chapter 4, we saw that the end of sin is death. And Cain, just before he kills Abel, is toying with the idea of sin. And God says to him, "Sin, Cain, is crouching at your door, ready to consume you, ready to bite you and pull you down into the abyss." But he gives in and kills his brother. And so the story of Cain and Abel is an illustration of where sin will take you. And it ends in death. It ends in murder. And that's why there's that the reference to blood in chapter 4, and also the a good way of understanding what's happening in Genesis chapter 4 is to think about Lady Folly in the book of Proverbs. And so Proverbs contrasts Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. Most of the beginning bit of Proverbs is on Lady Wisdom, but Lady Folly turns up, and the father says to the son, "Don't listen to Lady Folly," because Lady Folly calls out from up on the rooftop, "Come inside my house." You go inside her house, and you go down the stairs, and the stairs lead down to the abyss. Because that's the end of sin. Sin might be tempting, enticing. Cain might really have felt that Abel deserved to be killed, but the end of that was death. And then we came to Genesis chapter 5, and another little this side, another little screenshot from the Bible Project. And the Bible Project, this particular video from the Bible Project is talking about the plot and how the Bible has one large plot, God's big story. And Genesis chapter 5 is a genealogy. It can seem a little strange. There's a name, how old the guy was when he had his successor, his successor's name, how old the guy was when he died, and then the successor's age when he had his successor, and then how old he was when he died. And you'll notice the theme of death continuing on. And so when I preached on Genesis chapter 5, I kind of focused on a few of the names to bring out the themes of God's big story, because the genealogy obviously its literary purpose is to link the story of Adam with the story of Noah, but it's almost as though the genealogy is a clue that there's a code underneath that, but below that, underneath all our stories, there's a grid, there's a matrix, there's a real story taking place. And I think the numbers are a clue to that as well. The numbers are a little bit different between the Messianic text and the Septuagint. And so the numbers differ slightly, so you don't want to read too much into the numbers, but they're a clue that there's more going on than you realize. And what's worth noting in this genealogy is that there's a few themes going on. One of the themes is death. So Adam dies. It takes 900 years, and it's funny. Well, sort of black humor, but the serpent's words finally come true, but they take a long time to come true. So Adam's kind of sitting with the serpent's words in one ear, "You will not surely die," and living outside of Eden under the curse of death, knowing that he will die. And so for 900 years he lives between those two things, and then dies. And Seth is a replacement. Back in chapter 4, we see that Eve describes Seth as a replacement of Abel. A little bit of foreshadowing there of the way in which Jesus is our replacement. Then you'll notice that the ages are slowly diminishing. Not by much, but you can see the pattern that Adam lives much longer than Noah, but you'll see that even with Adam, Seth, and Enosh, the ages are getting smaller. So Enosh would think, oh yeah, I'm going to live a long time, but he dies at a younger age than both Seth and Adam. And so as people get further from God, as people get further away from God's presence, the supernatural power that must have imbued their bodies is wearing off. The magic of being in God's presence fades. There's also not God's story. God's big story has the theme of death. It has the theme of grace. Enoch is miraculously rescued, and Methuselah is given an extra set of years, almost 1,000 years, but still dies, because that's who God is that even though we've chosen death, and even though He's given us over to death, He reaches in and snatches us out of that plot line. It's also worth noting that we're talking about a narrative here that it's a narrative of symbols. It's a narrative of it's a story constructed with these various scenes that contain very potent symbols. I know Jordan Peterson's kind of done a detailed archetypal survey of Genesis, the book of Genesis. And that's worth looking at and thinking about the layers of psychological and moral meaning in Genesis. But just like the resurrection is a symbol, a potent symbol, but what makes the resurrection particularly important is that it's real, it actually takes place. Otherwise it's kind of like, well, I could read Watership Down and be moved by the symbols in Watership Down, but Watership Down didn't really take place. The resurrection really took place, which means that symbol really happened. And so these things really happened. They what is described corresponds with reality. We see that the world does have a particular order, but is damaged by sin. We see that the end of sin is death. These big patterns that Genesis 1 to 11 describe, we see played out in our world. And even with Lamech and Noah, the pattern of Scripture is God will say, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, and then X, Y, or Z happens. Lamech says Noah, God's going to rescue us through Noah, and God rescues humanity through Noah. So it's worth noting that when we approach Genesis, we have this record written by humans and God, and it's a reliable record because the God bit, well, God's a super narrator. Remember the monarchical vision, that phrase from Paul van der Klee? So God's able to look in and see accurately what's going on. And so what we have is, if God exists, and if God exists and God has spoken, then what God speaks is from that monarchical vision point of view, is from that point of view of a super narrator. And so it's reliable. And we can also see that it's reliable because what it describes corresponds with reality. It's also worth noting, though, that Genesis has a very narrow focus. So we're not told the details of Adam, Seth, or Enosh's life. We're not told how Methuselah spent his 1,000 years. We're not told how Enoch was taken up. And so the focus of Genesis 1 to 11 is very narrow, not comprehensive. But that's okay. Even a detailed history of D-Day, Battle of Berlin, or the Prime Ministership of Bob Hawke, is even a comprehensive history is going to still not be able to provide every detail. It's going to focus on particular themes or particular events. So it's worth keeping in mind when we think about the historicity, is that these symbols took place, but they're focused on they have a narrow focus. Well, that's the overview of Genesis 1 to 5. God creates a good cosmos, humans are created, but they make this terrible swap between life with God for death with the devil. And God in His grace gives us over to our evil, both as a, well, this is what you've chosen, this is what you'll get, but also as an act of mercy, because while that plays out, He rescues us. And warns us. So Genesis chapter 4, we see that the end of sin is death. But then we're part of a big story. And we see that in Genesis chapter 5. Thanks, and see you next time.